Hello, and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar who holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In each episode, we interview a different scholar, thinker, or writer, asking them to help us myth bust commonly held assumptions about utopias and dystopias.
If you like what you hear, please let us know by following the podcast, rating it on Spotify, or dropping us a message on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com. So, Matt, who do we have in this episode?
Well, Liam, you should probably know because you're the one doing the interview. So we've got Sebastian Mitchell with us on this episode, which is great. He's a colleague of yours, I believe.
Yep, someone I used to work with at the University of Birmingham, someone whose module I taught on as a PhD student.
Fantastic. Well, in this case, we had you doing the interview, so it'll give listeners a bit of a break from me, which is great. But I suppose I should probably pick up the kind of beginning, and to kind of just introduce it a little bit. So I had the pleasure of listening to your interview before you edited it, so I got the full experience. And yeah, I found it really interesting and very wide ranging. I thought if I were going to pick out something where it was really covering kind of new ground that we haven't sort of touched on yet or on the podcast, so I would say that it had mostly to do with Sebastian's work on the 18th century utopias, which I think so far we primarily tended to discuss sort of 20th, 21st century texts, maybe the 19th a little. And we've also gone back a little bit to the sort of 16th, 17th century originary kind of text. We've talked about more a little bit, for example. But in general, there's been less discussion of 18th century works, and I think there's less written on 18th century works in general. So it was really, really interesting to me to hear about the ways in which these ideas are explored, perhaps like less overtly during that period. So the sort of still utopian ideas are being written about, but they're just not written about in the same way. So I got a sense that there's a real sense in Sebastian's work of the importance as well of historical contingency. So this was sort of emphasized, about how it's important to understand the backdrop against which these texts are written and produced.
Yeah, I think there's this 18th century black hole, we've been calling it off recording, where my thesis was on 20th and 21st century literary dystopias. I'm aware of quite a lot of the 19th century texts, especially some of the ones that are maybe being discussed in the interview of Sebastian, and aware of the ones that are much earlier, some of the OG texts, as people might call them. But 18th century,
I'm sure Thomas More, when he was writing that, thought in the future one day someone's going to call this the OG text.
It's the OG text, the OG utopia. I mean, it's so good we called the whole genre, named the whole genre after it. But yeah, the 18th century is this black hole. I know, well, now I know something about it, but previous to catching up with Sebastian, I know or knew little to nothing about utopias in and around the 18th century.
I was also sort of interested. I thought he offered a really nice way of thinking about utopias in general as kind of dramatic texts with serious ideas, but that they're ultimately kind of literary, playful, and imaginative. And as someone who's been writing a book on playing utopian and dystopian fiction, that really kind of was something that resonated with me as well. Another thing I found really interesting was that Sebastian was talking about utopian texts as projections of the future, and that we can. I thought it was really interesting. He sort of said that we can see just how spectacularly wrong some utopian writers were kind of getting it. And his example was News from Nowhere by William Morris, who I think we've talked about briefly, I think, in one of the other interviews. And he's writing at the end of the 19th century, and he writes a kind of pastoral, idyllic vision of future London. And clearly, if the aim is to predict a better future, then Morris is just way off, because London gets significantly more industrialized rather than like less so over the next 100 or so years after he's written this novel. Although in his defense, his future is 2102, so there's still a little bit of time for a rather dramatic turnaround. I'm not sure I see London as entirely pastoral in 2102, but maybe he'll be proved right. But
We'll get some caps made, Matt, that say "Make London Pastoral Again."
oh, I like it. I
Our
like it.
first merch drop.
Yeah, it's a great. I would wear that, definitely. I would wear that. Um, but yeah, I thought this was, for me at least, it was particularly interesting because, in my view, one of the things that makes Morris's text a successful text, a great utopian text, is just how wrong he gets it. Actually, which kind of led me to think, in dystopias, we often see it as a kind of failure of the text when in reflecting back we see that the author got the prediction wrong.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of thinking here about the value we place on dystopian ideas that seem to come true. So we can explain, for example, the persistence and popularity of Orwell and Atwood's dystopias by saying, well, they kind of look like our world, and so that's scary, and that's why they're kind of really good dystopias in some way, or really resonant dystopias. And we might see, for example, like the popularity of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower recently as kind of, partly it's because it's set in 2024. And a lot of these bleak ideas that she plays with seem to be kind of on the horizon
Mhm.
in some way. So it's kind of that idea that she's prophetic in some way, that sort of suggests it's a good dystopia in some way. But in comparison, when it comes to utopian ideas, I almost think it's the opposite. Like the further they are from having come true, the more this seems to emphasize like the potency of the dream. It's
Mm.
like almost like a nostalgic impulse, isn't it? Like remember a time when one could dream of a world like Morris dreams of in News from Nowhere, and it's almost like that disconnect, isn't it? So
Mhm.
the further the idea gets from reality, like the more utopian it seems. But anyway, yeah, broadly, really, I think Sebastian's point is that there are these utopian ideas that are very much present in these 18th century texts, like Gulliver's Travels. But these texts are rarely meant to be kind of read as kind of straightforward blueprint utopias of the likes that we've discussed elsewhere on the podcast.
Yeah, I think that's a real core component of what Sebastian is talking about. I think I say it as oblique glimpses at utopia. I think I say something along those lines in the interview
Mm.
itself. And yeah, he talks about where utopia or utopianism is glimpsed at in texts where we might not immediately look to find them or think to look for them, showing that the impulse, although it may not be as prominent or as like explicit or as overt maybe as it is in other centuries and other periods, the impulse is still very much alive and kicking throughout the 18th century.
Even if it's just as a point of satire.
Exactly. Yeah. So then, Matt, do you think it's time for us to hand over to Liam in the past and Sebastian?
Absolutely. I can't wait.
Let's roll the intro.
So, Sebastian, can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yes, thank you, Leah. So, my name is Sebastian Mitchell. I teach in the English department at the University of Birmingham in the UK. I suppose I would say that I had two main research strands. One of them is on 18th century and 19th century literature and art, and the other one is on utopian literature. So I've published on both of these topics, and I think sort of the basis of our discussion here is that I had a book published first in 2020, which is called Utopia and its Discontents, Plato to Atwood. So it's a transhistorical work charting the development of utopian thought and literature. And then that was published again in paperback in 2022.
Amazing. Thank you, Sebastian. It's so lovely to have you on the podcast. For listeners, Sebastian and I know each other. I've taught on Sebastian's module when I was a PhD student, and Utopia and its Discontents was one of the books that I read during my PhD as well to get my head around the theory and some of the sort of the really important arguments, I think, in the area. So Sebastian, you said sort of you've got two major research interests, 18th and 19th century fiction, and then utopia.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, we've mentioned utopia a couple of times already. What does utopia mean to you?
So that's a really good question, and I think it's obviously something what one has to address if you're writing a monograph, transhistorical monograph on this particular topic. Utopia can be defined as you'll know from your own work and discussions with many other academics. There's a kind of huge range of different ways in which you can define utopia. Utopia often the kind of most straightforward way is to look at it in terms of the way the term is actually used, and also in terms of its origin as well, which is from Thomas More's Utopia, first published in 1516, and that work of course provides us both with a sort of definition of it. It's a work that's published in Latin, and in which Thomas More, working in conjunction with Erasmus as well, fashions this particular text. And the term utopia itself has a kind of playful element to it. So the word, it starts with a U, which of course is in a way the More is thinking in Greek usage here.
Yep.
He'd recently translated Lucian, who is a Latin period, but a Greek poet, and to do also with the sort of playfulness of Greek and the sort of satirical intention. The word itself has a play at the beginning, so on EU, which means good in Greek, and OU, which means no in Greek, and then you have the word topos, which means place, and then it has, because it's written in Latin and not Greek, he gives it a Latin suffix, and then we come up to the word utopia, which is a good place and no place at the same time. And of course, one of the sort of interesting things about More's text is that there are in fact two books here. There's a sort of introduction to Utopia itself, which is a discussion between Thomas More and his principal interlocutor, or one of the principals, a man called Peter Giles, and Cardinal Wolsey as well, and they talk about, it's really a kind of analysis of the state of England itself, and again there's quite a lot of sort of ironic play there, and it's also a discussion of the role of councillors, which was pertinent to Thomas More, who was a lawyer at that particular stage, but there was the opportunity to go and become one of the advisors, one of the councillors to Henry VIII. So the notion of land, of property, of wealth, of the inequalities of society, the role of councillors and what they can do in a system of governance of princes, are all things that are discussed, as I say, with a sort of ironic tinge in the first book, and then in the second book, which is presented by a man called Raphael Hythloday, who is presented as a Portuguese explorer. Now again, that name is quite interestingly assembled. Raphael, as in the angel, is kind of indicated in that name, but also Hythloday. If you look at the way that word is formulated in its Greek, it means an expert in nonsense, right? So you've got somewhere that is a good place and no place, explained to you by an expert in nonsense. So there's a kind of already a sort of hedging around about the notion of what the ideal state is. And of course, for More, that is a kind of, it's sort of presented there, and it has a number of features that we may well say would be a kind of ideal state. But there are also the things about equality. There is a sort of security in that place. There is an equal distribution of goods. There is a kind of democratic system that is put in place. But it is a uniform society, and it's a highly regulated society. So there is no principle, there's no exact right for freedom of travel, for example. So everybody needs to have their place. And it's determined by kind of an overarching authority about where people will actually live. Because one of the kind of interesting things about later utopias in the 19th century is what you do with populations. So you have the notion of Malthus, and one of the big problems is a surfeit, too many people. One of the great problems for More's period, of course, is having enough people, particularly after we have outbreaks of the plague in the 15th century. So one of the things is about sufficient numbers and having sufficient numbers, and the way in which the distribution of population as well. So his notion of an ideal society controls numbers in this particular way, where we have an even number of cities throughout the kind of island of Utopia, and that population is monitored. So if the numbers are too few in one place, they're moved they shift them over. It's also got some very curious features from a modern perspective, because this is a society that has slaves, which seems to be completely anomalous to the way in which many of the other aspects of that society is. And then it's all sort of, again, there is a sort of an ironic element to that. And we have to think that this is not the kind of system of slavery that we see in antebellum America, where there are ways in which this can be seen as manumitted, that the notion of slavery is much more to do with galley slaves and the way this particular model operates in the early modern period. So one has to be sensitive and careful on that. But it's also the way that it's actually placed. It's more saying that in a way that the ideal society, the question that it raises and it poses, is the extent to which an ideal society can be ideal for you and for people in that particular society, but what are the implications and consequences for people who are not enclosed within that particular social vision, who are citizens of that particular blessed state.
So I'm hearing, Sebastian, through... Firstly, actually, I hope that our listeners can hear your deep passion and knowledge for the subject on utopia and dystopia. And what I'm hearing from you is that they're playful, whether it's the linguistic playfulness of More, whether that is the sort of satirical element of these texts.
Yes.
And I guess also they're literary as well. I think the literary angle is where you're coming from here.
Yeah.
My question, and there's a follow-on, Sebastian, is... You're clearly very interested in utopia. It's one of your major research interests. You teach a brilliant module here at Birmingham with it as well. What initially drew you towards utopian studies, utopian texts? What interested you about it in the first instance?
Well, I think the thing was, it's kind of accidental. I was actually asked to teach on a utopian course many years ago in the early part of my career. And I think the thing that really appeals to me is the sort of the literary and what you can do with the literary. And I think it's also important to sort of recognise the qualities of the literary as well, all the things to do with sort of imaginative writing, points of view, the use of certain types of language, and all of those things is sort of, as I say, we come back to More, because he is so alert to those particular qualities, in also projecting something that is a sort of political a work of political philosophy at the same time. And I think Utopia is very good at doing that, of bringing sort of ideas, and quite serious ideas, into something that has a particularly sort of dramatic and literary quality to it. So I think it's it's the linking of those two things, with also a sort of projection of a society which is imaginative and also clearly an alternative to the contemporary as well. One of the things I think you always kind of say about utopia, we're talking about utopias rather than dystopias, right? Is one of the things about utopias are often doing is one often has to sort of think of them along a vertical and a horizontal axis. And if you're thinking about the horizontal axis, that is a sort of an alertness to a particular tradition or projections of the ideal state. and those may be both sort of much more straightforward sort of political projections, which you certainly get in utopian writing, where they're not, so interested in literary qualities, and the way in which those texts build on that, particular tradition.
How much they extrapolate almost.
Well, yeah. So I mean, when you look at, and sometimes they get them completely wrong. So one of the things that I think, so I can perhaps give two examples of the way in which that works. One of them was that I've read recently, one I've known for a long time. So one of the most kind of famous examples of this would be William Morris writing in the 1890s in News from Nowhere. Mm-hmm. Now, News from Nowhere is both a text that's absolutely rooted in it. So the two axes, of course, is one of a utopia is always a utopia for the present moment. Mm-hmm. So what the utopia is trying to do is address the immediate social, political, economic problems of its age. So utopias always, as I say, need to be read within that particular context, in their own now, what they're trying to do. And News from Nowhere is a book that is thoroughly engaged with the present of England, and it is England rather than Britain, I think, with William Morris in the 1890s. Now, one of the things that he does is he explicitly in that work. Now, News from Nowhere, you can see it in the title there. Yeah. There is a resonance, and of course it connects to derivatives of that notion of utopia.
Yes.
Now, Morris is actually, what he's really interested in is producing an anarchist vision, so it's not one with any government, and one that is a very rural vision of small communities. And so the text takes place in London. It's projected into the future, but it's a ruralized London that it sees. So one of the things he does talk about more, but it's clearly he sees it more as a sort of precursor to his kind of rural, free, liberal, entirely liberated society. He sees sort of aligns more with his own kind of medieval vision here. But the thing is, More was nothing like that. And the More produces really a very hierarchical, patriarchal, it's very patrician in the way that it's actually many of the elements and there is no sense of personal individual freedom at all. And Morris just completely misses that. I mean, he sees the sort of medieval, but he doesn't see that kind of element at all. So that in a way is a sort of traditional kind of aspect. The reason for him doing that in a way is because he's arguing against an American utopia, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, which had just been published in, which he admired in a number of ways. So he eventually, News from Nowhere arises out of a review that he wrote in the Commonwealth, it's called, which is his socialist newspaper. And what he wants to do there is he takes issue with Bellamy, who sees what is the problem with modern capitalist societies and their dreadful instabilities and inequalities. He says, right, well, what we need to do is that we need to have a fully technologized urban society. And he coins the notion of the industrial army. So he sees a sort of military, sort of regulated system. But people would serve in this for a particular period of time, and then they would have a sort of a much more free and liberal time subsequently to that. But Morris thinks this is wrong. This is a sort of, because all you're doing is adding on a sort of oppressive regulatory system here, whereas what you need is people will engage freely and happily and live fulfilled lives if you remove all the regulatory frameworks in which they standardly have to operate. So in a way, what I have to say is about that, you have both of these two utopias being written in the 19th century, which are addressing the kind of immediate problems of the society. They're politically both aligned, but they come to different solutions. The other, and as I say, if you look at about that, yes, the vertical rather than the horizontal axis. You can see that they look back to that particular tradition, and it's Morris who actually explicitly refers to the Utopia of Thomas More.
Yeah.
But as I say, there is a kind of significant misreading of the text. In a way to sort of legitimate his own subsequent imagining of the medieval period. Now, the other example I just wanted to give, which I thought was really kind of interesting, is that there is a translation of Thomas More's Utopia into French by a man called Rousseau, but not Jean-Jacques Rousseau, about a less famous namesake. And what's kind of interesting, it comes from the later part of the 18th century. And it's really interesting because it has quite a substantial introduction, a preface to it. And it does all the things that you would do. He talks about previous translations into French.
Yep.
It makes its claim for its own uniqueness, being faithful to the original text. And I don't know, one of the things I don't know about it is I don't know what its source text is. I don't know whether it's actually a translation from the Latin, or whether it's using earlier French and English versions. But one of the things about what's really interesting about this text is it's published in 1789, so the year of the French Revolution. So what it does when it talks about the particular text is it says that this is particularly relevant for our own times because of the notions of equality, a fair and just society which More is presented. It seems to be, and it's picking up on the spirit of the age. This moment in the revolution when we're trying to move towards. This is before the terror, of course, before we're doing it. But what's interesting also is, of course, one of the things that many writers have written about is that Thomas More's own, the sort of shift between the Thomas More who sort of working in humanist academic circles, collaborating with Erasmus, seems very different from the Thomas More who becomes Lord Chancellor, who was enforcing the various judicial decisions against Protestants. Who appears, and was involved in capital trials for these, and was really absolutely enforcing the law, to then also becoming sort of Thomas More, then who becomes the martyr for standing up for the Catholic Church, refusing to endorse Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn. Yep. And then, of course, he's kind of executed out of this. So what happens in that, these figures are very different. More is moved considerably in terms of his own political, social, legal outlook, I think, from the point of writing Utopia to what his subsequent demise. When he takes this particular stand, that what's interesting though, there are scholars who will, bet you would see a sort of certain lineage in that. But the point I think was that what the translation did was he picked up the moment about More being executed as standing up to monarchical authority, and of course that's stressed in the translation because the nature of standing up to traditional power and authority in 1789.
What I really picked up throughout that at the top, you sort of suggested that the utopian genre pays attention to both the political and like the real, the scary, the dry, the serious, whatever you want to call it, but also the imaginative. Yes. It's very expressive. It's very very literary. It pays attention to form and to language and so on. So, not wanting to put words in your mouth, but this is my personal belief. Utopias are the best type of literature because they can do both those things. They deal with the political and the real, with the imaginative, with the literary, with the formal, which is, I think, very beautiful and also very complex to do. You're sort of speaking a bit about trajectory there and time and how we're looking there. I wondered if this was where we could start to talk about some of your current work, some of your most recent work. So I was wondering, Sebastian, could you tell me, as much as you can, about any of your recent work in the utopian or dystopian sort of space, maybe how it relates to time or anything else that interests you?
Well, so there are two aspects here. One of them is a sort of long-term project, which I've only sort of started thinking about in a rather kind of impressionistic way, and then there's a project which is in a much more immediate way, which is, as I mentioned at sort of the outset, that my sort of academic career started in research terms of 18th century and early 19th century literature. And then the sort of utopian aspect has developed later, and as I've written sort of, as I say, sort of transhistorical study. So what in that book there is a chapter on 18th century utopian writing. But the thing I'm working on particularly at the moment is I've got a special issue of a journal which I'm working with a colleague in America on. So, and what we've got is a group of 7 of us, I think, contributing to it. So I'm actually contributing an article to an essay in this particular course, and that's called Utopias of the 18th Century.
Nice.
So what we're trying to do is just trying to look at aspects, conceptual approaches to utopia, but also sort of social approaches as well, and ideas that are very much current and exercising people at the moment. So sort of certain notions of sort of ecological ideas, ideas of race and globalization as well. So all of those sorts of things, we've got contributors who are looking at a range of those. Yeah. Yes. So, and I'm just working on that in terms of a poet I have written about before, an 18th century poet who's dreadfully obscure now, but was very well known through the 19th century. It's a poet called James Thomson. And he wrote a very long work called The Seasons, which was very popular here and in America actually through the 19th century. His dates are 1700 to 1748, but he oddly he's one as a sort of poet and a playwright in the 1730s. But then his poetry becomes very popular after his death, really, and then that really endures through the 19th century. So what I want to look at it's called The Seasons, and it does have a number of sort of projections, of imaginative projections of states. It's quite impressionistic because of the nature of it. It's poetry, and it has a sort of range of different views there. But what I thought would be quite interesting was to think about it. It describes Britain at this Isle of Bliss, Isle of Bliss amidst the subject seas. So you've already got something that's has a sort of slight sort of utopian twinge. You're pushing it a bit. There's something that's Edenic, and the relationship between those two ideas are interesting, if not straightforward. So I thought I would write about that, and then I would try and also think about it in terms of some contemporary theories about the environment as well, to see how we would get. So that's the kind of the thing that I'm one of the things that I'm currently looking at. And on that basis, that I spent some time. There's a Utopia collections at Penn State Library. So I've been fortunate to have been able to spend a couple of weeks there, just working through the 18th century materials from that, and really just we're trying to sort of think about an overall framework for this particular project, and also just sort of looking in a bit more detail at the sort of range of utopian writing in that period. The period itself is quite interesting in that there has been a fair amount of recent work on 18th century utopian writing, but there is a sort of famous account by a utopian scholar from the 20th century, a man called A.O. Morton, who said that he sort of saw that the 18th century was almost the sort of period where no kind of interesting utopian writing was produced at all, which of course is not true. What's true, I think, is more true is in the way that the 19th century is a period where you see things that are explicitly utopian, where they're clearly, where those sort of large scale projects about an alternative society where political and social and personal relationships are perfected.
Yeah.
And there's also a kind of sort of possibility, or there's a sort of suggestion that there may be some way to bring that about. That's a 19th century idea.
Yeah.
18th century ideas, you have to sort of think about them in slightly different ways, because they won't badge themselves in quite that way. Yet that clearly the notions, there is sort of things that we can really see as utopian currents in it, just in the entire project of the French Revolution, and the drive, the notions of rights, and certainly, parts of writing in Rousseau as well. We can see things that, would be clearly identified as having a sort of a utopian provenance.
So I'm hearing from you then that a key distinction between 18th century utopias and 19th century is that the 18th century utopias are maybe a bit more oblique, and they're a bit more...
Yes, and I mean, you have to
look at them in a certain...
Yeah, exactly that, I think. The one of the, there was a great text of the 18th century, and the great kind of satirical text is Gulliver's Travels.
Yes.
Now, Gulliver's Travels in no shape or form is trying to project a utopia. But the point about, there are 2 points about that. It's sort of the notions of perfection, either through scientific means, is one of the kind of currents that run through that. And the notion, of course, in the final book, in book 4, is something that is obviously engaged with a sort of notion in the society of the Houyhnhnms, this horse-like society, is something that clearly is seen to be a sort of Arcadia, a perfected society. So there's the sort of the notion of that, of an ideal society, and what would be the values that underpin that, is being presented in the text. And of course, the thing is, there's some, the recent scholarship on that work has shown is that Swift knew his more, and there are kind of quite extensive references to utopia through the text itself. So it is exactly that. It's a sort of an obliqueness, and looking at the text in a slightly different way, that allows you to see these sort of utopian currents in them.
So I suppose on that, Sebastian, I sort of said to you before we started recording that I typically see or understand or come to utopia and dystopia from the 20th and 21st centuries primarily. Of course, knowing and appreciating more, and Plato, sort of before him and whatnot. Whereas actually 18th and early 19th century utopia, dystopia, I know some of the names. I know Gulliver's Travels, although I did forget it earlier before we were recording. I know some of the other texts that you've mentioned during this chat are ones that I'm familiar with by name at very least. But I was wondering if through this special issue, that you're working with, have there been any sort of any further uncoverings? You sort of say you're working with poets.
Yes. Well, one of the things, as I mentioned already, was the translation, and that was part of this, to be able to kind of was in this particular collection. So I thought that was just really, really interesting about the way in which a particular text is being shaped. So there are kind of interesting texts themselves. I mean, one of the sort of ways that obviously, and I don't think this would be a surprise, and it's in Gulliver's Travels, is that the things that tend to appear are often kind of travel narratives themselves. So some of these are kind of extraordinary. So there's one that uses it's almost it's always kind of extraordinary sort of mood piece, which is produced quite early on in the century, and it's about an island which is adjacent to Utopia.
Okay.
And the whole thing reads, almost like a sort of sentimental novel. So it's emotionally heightened all the way through. It's full of exclamation marks, kind of really extreme emotional states. It's about princes and princesses, and this sort of people meeting, and just the whole thing. It's almost it has a sort of heightened operatic quality to it, but it's kind of almost it almost has a sort of postmodern feel about it, in the sense that it's completely undifferentiated. So it goes on in this particular vein for page after page, chapter after chapter, and what you have is it's almost a sort of a utopia of personal fulfillment. It's sensual delight. And it's just sustained for page after page. Now, what's kind of interesting about that is I suppose when I say it's interesting, because it seems desperately boring when you're actually reading through it. But it's obviously popular because there's a second. It says there's a second part to it, but the second part is not produced until the first book is being produced and sold, and when it's seen to be successful, the second one is actually produced. Utopia can also be used in ways that seem to have absolutely no connection to utopia at all. So there is, I've got to get the dates right for this, 1714, when Queen Anne dies in 1714, George the I comes in. So we begin the Hanoverian succession. And there's a poem that talks about, it's called Canary Birds in Utopia. And Utopia is meant to be Britain. And the canary birds are Hanoverians. It's a sort of an exotic species that shouldn't actually be inhabiting in Britain at all, but coming in and in a way taking over the sort of the land of liberty. But actually, Utopia itself, there's the indication there. It's the kind of word is being used, but it doesn't really have any implication other than describing. It becomes a sort of synonym for Britain. So it is curiously. The sort of interest is because it's such a sort of curiously its use would seem to be so loaded, but it's also sort of so empty absent at the same time.
What was the name of the first text you talked about?
It's Elizabeth Hayward's Memoirs of a Certain Island Adjacent to the Kingdom of Utopia in 1726.
Thank you, Sebastian. That's very wordy as well. It's a very long title. Well, Sebastian, I don't want to grill you for too much longer. It's been a really fascinating and quite wide-ranging discussion. It's been really interesting and insightful to hear, I think, how we predominantly, maybe in our discussions of utopia and dystopia, and even in our teaching of these texts, we tend to focus on more recent texts overall. The balance skews towards more modern and contemporary. So for me, even sort of hearing a number of texts that I wasn't familiar with previously is super helpful. Myself and Matt, we joke often that this podcast, among many things, is a vanity project for us to just develop our reading lists, the things that we need to be reading. So with that in mind, Sebastian, final sign-off question is, if people should be reading about utopias, dystopias, maybe utopias of the 18th, 19th century or older or more contemporary, whether it's a fictional text or a theoretical text, really it's just, what would you recommend and why?
Right, so I would always,
other than your book, of course.
Yes, no. So there are things I can recommend in there are two ways of doing this. There are things that I think have been really influential on me. And what I think is a work. So the work I found most, particularly when I was writing the book, that I really enjoyed and thought was sort of an amazing book, even though ironically it's not fond of utopias in the way in which we've been talking about them today, Liam. because we've been talking things which seem to be explicit, have a very kind of clear definition of utopia. So it's a sort of projection of the ideal society. Maybe it mentions the word utopia. It's a translation of utopia. It has the features, it's a travel, it's going to travel, or maybe if it's, in the modern age, it'll be a sort of science fiction, romance. And it has either the feature of the utopia or the dystopia, which is often a utopia gone wrong, hasn't it? But the work that I particularly enjoyed is Ernst Bloch, the German academic critic, political philosopher. I think you might even describe him, the very odd one at that. And there's a 3-volume work called The Principle of Hope in translation. And what he does, so his utopianism is much more sort of freewheeling, and you can find it. He talks about a sort of utopian in spirit or a utopian component in all kinds of work, which is really a sort of transformative idea, and transformative idea of the self, of consciousness. So it's a magnificent work in the range of, even if you don't agree with all of these ideas, it's a sort of magnificent work in the way in which he tries to trace this sort of utopian impulse through a sort of global vision of history and a kind of, an enormous great range of different artifacts as well. So there was sort of, it has the problem of if utopia can be anywhere, how do you discern it? But at the same time, there's a sort of an enormous sort of optimism and a sense of energy and admiration for artistic and literary representation. And it's one of the things I think also about that is the notion of when we're talking about utopias being a sort of literary activity, it's the way that the notion of literature and art itself can be a sort of central activity, that reading things that often for it's very much against the view that you only read books or you only read literature when there's nothing better to be done, that there's something actually transformative, important and imaginative in its projection, and that can have a wider effect on society itself. I think that idea is actually really difficult in the modern age. I mean, we're talking about writing, we talk really more about utopias today, and in a way I'm pleased about that, because I think I am more interested in utopias than dystopias. But utopias are very, very difficult in the modern age to write, because and I think the contemporary circumstances have been such that imagining a large-scale social model is something that is not which can accommodate and make people satisfied. Those kinds of approaches are not ones that suit the sort of temper of the contemporary age, certainly in the West.
I think it's easier to imagine something bad than it is good.
Yes.
Sadly, at this point in time.
Yes, I think if you're asking me about what books, if I was from the 18th century, I would read, I would go certainly to Gulliver's Travels. I think that would be the central work if you've not read any 18th century works. I mean, there are other works which I think are highly influential in that field. But I think that's the one which I think probably has the most kind of resonance, mainly because it talks, so it addresses that difficulty of the notion of the ideal society and that cusp about what you need to do, may be ideal for you, but what are the actual implications of finding that particular society.
Well, Sebastian, thank you so much for your time today. That's not the first time that Bloch's been mentioned, so clearly he's rising to the very top of our recommendations list, but thank you for your really insightful discussion here and really opening my eyes to all manner of texts that I've known of for a very long time but maybe haven't paid enough attention to. So I've got a bit of homework to go away and do that. So thank you for joining us on the podcast.
You're welcome, Liam, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Cheers, thank you. Once again, I'd like to express my thanks to Sebastian for appearing on the podcast. His insights into all things utopian in the 18th century were really eye-opening, and I feel I've learned a lot. If you found this episode interesting, please do let us know. You can follow and rate us on your podcasting platform of choice, leave us a comment, or drop us an email on utopiananddystopianfictions@gmail.com. Next episode will be our last interview of the first series of the podcast, and we've got a brilliant guest lined up, so I promise you won't want to miss out. As such, don't forget to join us next time as we dig into some more utopian and dystopian fictions.